In this video, we'll be talking about the rules of consensus, or Nakamoto consensus. We'll explain what it is and why it's important. There are certain aspects of the Bitcoin protocol that can't be changed unless the majority of its participants agree to do so. These hard-set rules are enforced by the open source software. If a node detects a participant who's not following these rules, the offending participant would get immediately banned and forbidden from relaying information through the blockchain. Here are the rules that we'll be going over: the difficulty adjustment, monetary policy, transaction fees, transaction structure, and the block size limit. Let's start off with the difficulty adjustment. Bitcoin adjusts the difficulty for finding new blocks so that one is found every 10 minutes approximately. Right now, we're showing you a chart of the historical block time, and you can see that it tries to average around 10 minutes. This first rule of consensus ensures that production of Bitcoin remains at a controlled level and transactions are sent at regular and predictable intervals. The difficulty adjustment happens every 2016 blocks, or roughly every 2 weeks. You'll notice that time is often measured in terms of blocks. If you want to know more about mining blocks, see our video Technology in Bitcoin Part 2. As you can see, the difficulty for mining a block has risen significantly over time in response to increased numbers of miners joining the network and the advent of more sophisticated mining technology. Without a difficulty adjustment, blocks would be found in less than a minute and all 21 million Bitcoin would have been produced by now, which leads to our next rule of consensus: the maximum reward for each block found. Unlike fiat money, which can be printed at will forever, Bitcoin has a maximum number that can never be produced at a predetermined rate. According to Bitcoin's monetary policy, the amount rewarded for mining a block halves every 4 years until the last Bitcoin is mined sometime in the year 2140. The total amount of Bitcoin is capped at just a few decimals under 21 million. As miners make progressively less money for finding a block, they will have to rely more and more on the transaction fees levied to send Bitcoin. Transaction fees are another aspect of Bitcoin governed by the rules of consensus. Transactions that have been sent out but are waiting to be confirmed sit in what's called the mempool. Miners that win the right to mine the next block will scan the mempool and decide which transactions to confirm. Typically, miners want to make the most money possible, so they will include the transactions that pay the highest fees. As you can see from this graph, the higher fee green transactions make up the bulk of the transactions picked up from the mempool, whereas the lower fee blue transactions have to wait longer to get picked up. The fee you pay only matters in BTC, where the traffic can get congested. In Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin SV, the traffic gets cleared every time, so it doesn't matter what fee you pay, and we'll explain why in a moment. A common misconception is that the fees are based on the amount of Bitcoin sent, when actually it's based on the amount of data your transaction takes up in bytes. Here's an example of a large amount of Bitcoin sent with a lower data size, and you can compare this to a small amount of Bitcoin sent with the high data size. The amount of data in a given transaction can vary based on the type of address or the number of inputs. What do we mean by inputs? This leads us to our next rule of consensus, the transaction structure. Bitcoin works kind of like the banknotes in your pocket. If you wanted to buy a $28 t-shirt, you'd have to hand over $30 and get $2 in change. Bitcoin works the same way with inputs and outputs. Let's cover those key terms first. In Bitcoin transactions, when you're sending something, it's called an input. And when you're receiving something, it's called an output. When you have money that hasn't been spent, it's called an unspent transaction output, or UTXO. Just as an analogy, every paper bill you have in your wallet would be called a UTXO in Bitcoin. Your wallet balance would be a collection of your UTXOs. So going back to the example, if Ted wants 15 Bitcoin for the t-shirt and Bob only has a UTXO of 20 Bitcoin from a previous payment, Bob has to send a 20 Bitcoin input and will get 5 Bitcoin back in change as an output. Ted would get his 15 Bitcoin output for the t-shirt And in the end, Ted now has a UTXO of 15 Bitcoin and Bob has a UTXO of 5 Bitcoin. To an outside observer looking at this, it's hard to tell the difference between an output generated for the purchase and the output generated for the change. Now that you're familiar with the transaction structure, let's go over the format of Bitcoin addresses. Bitcoin addresses can follow a few different formats, which have evolved over time. Here are some examples of them. They have to start with a certain character like 1, 3, or BC1. Bitcoin Cash uses a certain address type that starts with a Q and sometimes includes the prefix Bitcoin Cash to reduce confusion. There are free online tools where you can use to convert this back to a legacy address that starts with a 1. A Bitcoin address is similar to an email address in that in order to send or receive an email, you need an identifier such as an email address that can be shared and a private password to log into the system. In Bitcoin, the email address is known as a public key and the password is known as a private key. Unlike most email networks though, there's no password reset function, so it's extremely important that you keep your private key safe because it ultimately determines your ownership of your money. We explain more about security in our Bitcoin usage video. The last and most controversial rule of consensus states that the size limit of blocks cannot be changed. Earlier in our video, we showed you that BTC experiences traffic congestion, and this is because of the block size capacity. Because the block size capacity is low and can only fit a certain amount of transactions each confirmation, it forces users to enter a bidding contest, making the fees for a fast confirmation to sometimes pass a few dollars. Proponents of increased block sizes wanted lower fees and could not convince the majority, so they were forced to branch off and continue their own version of Bitcoin in a process known as a hard fork. This is how Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin SV were created. One of the beautiful things about Bitcoin is the lack of a centralized governance system. There is no one person in charge. Bitcoin's governance system was designed so that decisions are made by miners and users of the network. Satoshi wrote about this elaborate system in his white paper. Proof of work is essentially one CPU, one vote. The majority decision is represented by the longest chain, which has the greatest proof of work effort invested in it. If a majority of CPU power is controlled by honest nodes, the honest chain will grow the fastest and outpace any competing chains. If you want to know more about proof of work, please see our video Technology in Bitcoin Part 2. Thanks for listening.